think when you're designing an environment like Mbumbulu, where traditionally it's a rural area, which is actually developing into a semi-urban area with the developments coming through, then things to consider are, you have to then consider partly the cultural aspects of it, because there's a certain cultural aspect which persists in the local community. And sometimes it's an implied cultural aspect, which you have to be tactful for. Priority of zones, priority of spaces, and subservient zones as well. The entrance is always a big thing in terms of entrance and approach. It's always a big thing. And if you can, there needs to be a yard. A yard, I think, is quite an important thing because that's where the engagement happens. Traditionally, people used to cook outside, used to tell stories outside, used to play outside, used to have chickens and all those kind of things, which still persists in a large part in those kind of areas. So if you have a yard, the gogo can sit outside in the yard and can watch the children play, which actually acts as surveillance. Can actually start to have, once you encourage people to bring them out of their little cocoon and bring them out into the yard, it actually starts to encourages that engagement with the passerby, with the neighbor, it encourages that engagement with the earth, we can plant, we can sweep the yard, we can maintain the yard, we can do all sorts of little things like that. In an environment like that, it's all about the community. There's an innate sense of and a strength in the community, so people understand the value of each other. So you have to encourage as much interaction as possible, because in the traditional sense, in the urban areas, it's all about privacy. My little yard, hey, don't see me, don't see you, high walls, hey, I just want to keep my privacy, leave me in peace. But in an environment like that, actually, it's all about approach, engagement. Is your neighbor all right? So when you don't see your neighbor for a couple of days, you get worried. Hey, send your kid, hey, just ask if the neighbor's all right, what's ever happening. Oh, hey, go ask whatever, I'm short of salt, go ask salt and all this kind of thing. So that actually encourages that sense of community. So whatever intervention that you actually come up with, it needs to foster a sense of community. It needs to foster a sense of culture in a way. Might not be physical, but has to be implied. Could be implied as well. And obviously, it can't be subservient or just haphazardly built, because there needs to be some sort of worthiness, or needs to be some sort of, I'm looking for the most appropriate word. It needs to be a product that people can be proud of, and doesn't mean that it has to be expensive, but through design, you can actually achieve a product that someone can be proud of, which actually fits in with their appropriate budget. Give people a product that will afford them dignity. And once someone has a product which affords them dignity, they'll be proud of it, they'll take care of it, they nurture it, and suddenly they stop looking at themselves as the poor me kind of person. It starts looking at themselves as this proud guy. I've got this, now I can go forward. So that's the whole psyche starts to change once you give someone something or a product that they can be proud of. So that's another advice. Another thing too is that, which has been a big discourse with the architects and people in the built environments and the government, is that we really need to gear up and start to try out alternative building technologies. Unlike the conventional, which the brick and mortar, people have been subjugated in thinking that brick and mortar is actually a level up. Because if you're coming from a shack, the last thing you'd want to do is have a wall that is made out of corrugated iron, because that's what you see yourself as, that being a lesser form of construction. But now, once you start actually designing it in an appropriate way, where sometimes you can have mixed construction. Looking at the materiality, is that traditionally the housing typology in South Africa has always been brick and mortar, but through other housing technologies which persist globally, which South Africa has yet to really engage with. We can get structurally insulated panels, which can actually be easily manufactured off-site, prefabricated construction, which is also another form of construction which can be prefabricated, brought to site and erected within a fraction of the time it will cost to build a traditional brick and mortar house. You can also get mixed construction. I know in Cape Town, there's an architectural company that's actually exploring with sandbag technology, where they're using the sand from the site to actually build the house, where through sandbags with the portal frame and just cladding, which actually has a much better thermal insulated properties than the normal brick and mortar construction. Then the housing typologies, obviously, depending on the environment or the context. I think that's quite important. I think we also need to start looking at semi-detached houses, multi-story walk-ups. Obviously, it will be maximum 3 floors because the legislation says you can't go more than 3 floors without a lift. And once you start putting a lift into a development, it shoots up the costs quite a bit. So when you're looking at buildings like that, where buildings which are semi-detached and creating a campus feel, creating a node, creating interesting spaces, because it's not just about the physical structure, it's also about the spaces that those buildings leave out, which has been a big criticism with the conventional RTP house, because what they do is already you've got a small restricted site, they put a house in the middle, and it becomes very difficult to extend that property, because you can't extend on either side. You have to actually literally break down a majority of the walls to actually extend, then it becomes a new house. Whereas if you start actually placing the units maybe at the edge of the site, maybe depending on the area, if it's an urban area, place it on the street front so it engages with the street front and creates some sort of urban street frontage. Or if maybe it's a more township kind of neighborhood, place it at the back so you can actually have other activities happening in the forefront. You might be a mechanic, you might want to put a container for a tuck shop, you might want to do whatever, or one might try to extend in the future. So you might have an opportunity to build a whole other unit while still maintaining that subsidized unit. So I think you need to really be careful on the placements and the arrangement and the spaces that are left over when you are designing your units. So the site design is just as important as the physical building superstructure. I think in places like Umbumbulu, when you're designing in places like Umbumbulu, obviously, because it's actually it's a gradually gentrifying area, where you find that it was a rural area, now people are actually developing into a more urban area. So you have to consider, because sometimes access becomes a big thing. How do you access your site? When you bring in materials, it's actually going to be a big thing. Sometimes you underestimate that a big truck won't be able to fit in to a small little pathway. Now, how will you be able to get your raw materials from the truck to your site, the terrain? Sometimes I think because lots of people underestimate the value of architectural constraints or architectural opportunities like sight line, views, wind direction, all those kind of things that people don't consider when they're normally building their own little mud huts or mud room, whatever. That's the architectural value add that you'll be bringing into the area. So I think site design, you have to be considerate of the typical or the typical architectural typologies, typical architectural constraints or typical architectural philosophies that you normally imply in the site, but be cognizant of who you're designing for, what you're designing for, and what you want to gain. Because a typical example, I touched upon it a little bit when I was talking, is that if this gogo is going to build, if you're going to build like a 1 or 2 bedroom little shack, and this gogo's got 6 kids, one day, if this gogo has a little bit of money, he's going to build a room on the outside. Now, by the mere fact of the kids sleeping on the outside, now the gogo doesn't have any surveillance on what happens at night when the gogo is sleeping. Hence, you find that in many informal settlements and many in township areas where the houses or where the accommodation is not actually a single dwelling unit, where you find that through expansion or growth of the family, you find that they start building houses outside. You find that kids, or let's say other social problems, start to spring up. Teenage pregnancies, high rates of HIV/AIDS, abuse of drugs and alcohol. Because what happens is that when the gogos are asleep, these kids wake up, they go outside, do what they have to do, and they come back. So there's never that surveillance that actually should occur where like in a normal housing construct. So housing has a big influence on the social dynamics of the community. So I think that's what we really need to focus on. That's what we really need to engage with. That a house is not just an element to put your roof over, but it can change the whole social construct, or not just of the family, but of the community if it's done appropriately and tactfully. Okay, how we can actually start to incorporate or design a more appropriate vernacular in response to the cultural construct is that it's actually quite difficult, because what happens is that through colonialism, the colonists came through and said, hey, this is not good. You guys are behind. You should be building like this, you know. Hence, you get all these colonial buildings that actually persist till now in colonial styles. Whereas the vernacular never got an opportunity to evolve and grow and morph into a more contemporary, you know, form of building. So essentially, the cultural aspects in terms of building environment has no identity in terms of architecture. There's no identity in terms of architecture. So what you need to do is, but we need to be careful though, is that we mustn't superimpose an old vernacular which was appropriate in, let's say, wherever in the rural areas, you know, Kwanguza or Mzingazi or wherever, you know, in the rural areas, and superimpose it in the urban. Because if you say that you're going to be using a straw or a thatched roof, you need to source a specific thatch from somewhere, which is not really available in the area. You need to maintain it every year, which actually adds to the cost of actually that whole building, you know. So when you look at the building and the lifespan and affordability of that building, the costs actually end up bulking up if you have to fetch that piece of thatch about 40 kilometers away and bring it to the site to repair it every year. You know, you have to hire someone to repair it every year. You know, you have to treat it, obviously, every so often, and so it doesn't get eaten up by insects and borers, you know. So you have to consider that. So now how do you now, instead of replicating or superimposing something which persisted in a century or two ago, how do you now reinterpret it into a more contemporary, still stemming from or taking the essence of it, but now reinterpreting with modern materials, with readily available materials, and in contextualism, you know, contextualism in terms of where we're going to be sourcing out the material. Contextualism, does it really respond to the sites, to the current building construct, but at the same time, giving it identity. I think that's what we're challenging with in terms of the South African ideal or South African construct or South African housing architectural, that the vernacular cultural architectural typology is missing because we're still struggling to find our piece, our niche, our footing within the bigger scheme of developing an appropriate cultural vernacular architecture in a contemporary environment. It creates an amazing opportunity because what happens is that I think most of the time is that we as architects don't give enough time to the research component of any project. You know, if you really want to have a truly engaging project, you have to do appropriate research and you have to understand who you're building for, the context you're building with, and what you want to achieve, you know, at the end of the day. So I would say focus on the research. And sometimes you find that people say, we've come across instances where, especially back in the day, where people refused, you know, to live in a double-story building, you know, because it's an old gogo who comes from a rural area. He's always lived in a set of rondavels all his life. He's comfortable with engaging with the earth. It's not that he doesn't want to develop or doesn't want to be a culture, but her connection is more stronger, more tangible, where she can actually walk on the ground and have a sense of feeling. So it's not, but sometimes you find that people want to evolve, they're more open-minded because people are building double stories all the time. They're more engaged or they're more susceptible now to actually building up a multi-story building, living in apartment blocks, living in double-story houses. But now how do you provide that in a way that is still going to be beneficial and a way that people are still going to feel comfortable with? Because that's what architecture does. Architecture is not unfortunately, it's not a utopian kind of building, or it's not a utopian kind of approach because we are all individual. So we all have our own needs and we all have our own inspiration. That's why architecture is a response of society and self, you know. So I think you need to really understand what the needs of Gogo are, where Gogo is coming from. We'll be able to maintain this house, you know. What materials we'll be able to give Gogo, which is actually have a lasting kind of longevity, but with as little maintenance as possible. What kind of design form are you going to give Gogo? In fact, because Gogo now is old, he can't be going up a set of stairs because you're not going to be providing a lift for him. So what kind of design are you going to be giving Gogo, which can actually be able to maneuver around the whole property and still have surveillance and control over all the occupants, especially since he has young grandkids. You know, because he's the eldest, he needs to have security over the whole thing. When you're considering thresholds in an environment like Umbumbulu, is actually quite interesting because most rural areas don't have a physical threshold. They have an implied threshold, implied threshold by the fact that, you find that there'll be gardening, there'll be a little garden patch, in front of the house where people need to meander around a garden patch, or there'll be a walkway or a roadway, and people actually enter from that roadway. Obviously, sometimes if you have a little garden patch now, you want to prevent it from, goats and dogs and all this. So that's where actually the fences come from. They don't come from a security point of view. They just come from a protective point of view from whatever they have inside. Where unlike in an urban environment, like a normal suburbia, where threshold is a physical barrier, which you on the outside, I'm on the inside, I don't want you to see what I'm doing. I don't care what you're doing on the outside, Don't come into my yard. Don't even look at my yard. So that's the dynamics that people have. Another thing too is that it's not just about privacy, but because of the security issues that people have within a suburban area, where they have to protect themselves and their property. Hence these high walls, electric fences, this fortress kind of feel that's actually is actually predominant or prevalent in the urban areas. Whereas it's quite on the opposite, because we have to maintain that sense of engagement with the community. Community in terms of neighbors, community in terms of passers-by, because their strength in a community like that is people knowing each other. If you see someone on the street, people look out for you. If they know there's an old gogo there, they need to see that the gogo is right. No one's tampering with the gogo. So the community looks out for each other. So the threshold is always an implied threshold in a situation like that. So just have to be tactful. How, depending on the site, obviously it's going to be site specific. So depending on what the site is, I wouldn't encourage physical barriers, because physical barriers create that segregation and separation amongst you as an individual and the community. So, and in terms of consultants, I think in a project like that is because you have to have consultants who are open-minded to exploration, open-minded to test out new things. Far too often consultants are, it's because it becomes a thin line between profit and product. So some conventional, especially engineers and some quantity surveyors, whoever, they're very reluctant to test out new ideas or just go with the form. They have systems, already have systems set up in the offices which will churn out these things, which if you have a system, it actually ensures more profit towards you because you're spending less time on you. So if you find that, just like if you find you come across open-minded consultants who are actually able to engage with you, test out new things, try new things, and great stuff are bound to happen in circumstances like that. So I think just be careful. The type of consultants you have can actually make or break the project, because obviously as an architect, you're going to be trying out new different things, new typologies. You might even try out new building technologies or building typologies, But if someone has never done that, they must be willing to engage with you and developing that with you, going every step of the way and not be only profit-driven. In wrapping up, thank you guys for this opportunity, me sharing a little part of what I know about the South African local context and social housing and its construct and the history of where we come from. I'm Sibusiso Sitole, an aspiring architect. Hopefully, we're going to meet up again in the future, somewhere, somehow. You hear about me, definitely. Thanks.